Big Shaq thought he left the court behind, until justice called him home. When 78-year-old Ms. Odessa Monroe is humiliated by the very people sworn to protect her, a buried legacy reawakens, and her son, a silent Delta Force commander, steps out of the shadows. What begins as a quiet injustice unravels into a chilling network of corruption, racism, and betrayal, and as Shaq stands on the front porch not with rage, but with truth, the whole city is forced to choose silence or reckoning. This isn't just a story, it's a warning. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Oak Ridge Avenue always wore a quiet hush, like an old church just before the choir begins to hum. The trees stood tall and sun-kissed along the sidewalk, casting gentle shadows over cracked pavement. It was a neighborhood that aged with grace. Tired wooden fences, porches that groaned with every season, and people who nodded before speaking. Life here didn't rush. It remembered. In the middle of this modest stillness stood the corner house with the green shutters and jasmine growing along its gate. It belonged to Ms. Odessa Monroe, 78 years old, spine curved like a question mark, and eyes that had seen more than she ever told. A retired school librarian, Odessa had lived in that house for nearly 50 years, longer than most of the Oaks had been full-grown. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the weight of story time and sermons, and she had the kind of silence that made people instinctively lower their own voices. Each morning, she opened her wooden screen door, with the same ritual. A soft creak, the scent of lavender lotion on her hands, and a glass of iced tea set gently on the small table outside. She'd sit in her cane-backed chair, watch the street, and hum to herself. She didn't look for trouble, and she never asked for anything. But trouble, as it happens, isn't always so polite. Her closest neighbor was Big Shaq. Shaquille O'Neal, known to most as a basketball giant, but in Oak Ridge just the man who brought groceries, fixed porch railings, and always asked about your blood pressure. He had a presence that didn't need to announce itself. You felt him walk into a space like thunder rolling in from the west, powerful, comforting, and too large to ignore. Yet for all his size, there was gentleness in him that Watts folks. He had learned the art of stepping lightly, in places that carried fragile hearts. Shaq had taken to checking on Odessa every few days, a habit that began with a broken heater one winter, and simply never stopped. There was something in her, perhaps a memory of his mother, or maybe just that she never once asked for an autograph, that kept him coming back. He'd sit with her, sip sweet tea, and talk about nothing important. It was the kind of nothing that meant everything. Across the street lived Renee Chambers, early 50s, a widow with a salt and pepper afro and a watchful gaze. Her front porch was her post, and her chair might as well have been a throne. She saw everything. Renee was the kind of neighbor who didn't miss the sound of a screen door closing, who could tell by the birds if someone was up too early. Some folks found her nosy. Odessa called her the second pair of eyes God sent me. It was Renee who first noticed the new patrol car. It came creeping down the street a little too slow, a little too often. A pair of young white officers, unfamiliar faces with clipped smiles and eyes that didn't soften when they waved. Renee watched from her porch as they circled the block 3 times in one afternoon, their windows down, radios hissing soft static. They didn't talk to anyone, didn't stop to ask about community programs or local concerns. They just watched, like hunters marking patterns. At first Renee thought maybe it was coincidence. Oak Ridge had been quiet for so long, it was possible someone downtown figured it needed a little more law and order, a little more presence. But then the questions started. A mail carrier, a black man who'd been on the same route for 10 years, was stopped and asked for ID. A teenager walking home from basketball practice was followed all the way to his driveway. One of the officers even questioned a woman sweeping her front porch, asking if she actually lived there. The tone wasn't angry. It was clinical, detached. Something in the air shifted. Shaq noticed it too. When he pulled up in his pickup truck one afternoon to drop off some groceries for Odessa, the patrol car rolled slowly past. One of the officers stared at him, then down at his plates. Shaq didn't respond. He didn't give them the satisfaction. But later he would tell Renee, "They don't come here to serve. They come here to search." Odessa, ever watchful, felt it before anyone said it out loud. She began locking her screen door in the daytime, started writing in her journal more. She had seen too many seasons not to sense when one was about to shift violently. There was an edge in the stillness now. a tension that buzzed beneath the calm. The neighborhood looked the same. Kids still rode bikes, dogs barked at squirrels, and wind chimes sang in the evenings. But the feeling was different, like everyone was waiting for something, and no one wanted to name it. One afternoon, Odessa sat on her porch while the jasmine swayed in the breeze. Renee crossed the street, carrying a bowl of peach cobbler. Made too much, she said, which was a lie they both understood and welcomed. They sat together, two black women with nearly a century and a half of life between them, and talked about books, about weather, about grandchildren who never called enough. But somewhere in the rhythm of that conversation, Odessa's voice dropped. You feel it too, don't you? Renee didn't pretend. Every time that cruiser turns the corner, they look at us like we already did something. They look at us like we never stopped. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with understanding, thick and unspoken. Both women had lived through times when the color of your skin was the most dangerous thing about you. They had marched, mourned, and managed to survive. But now, survival was no longer enough, not when the past wore new uniforms and smiled behind windshields. Later that evening, Shaq came by with a new bag of oranges and a box of her favorite ginger snaps. Odessa smiled, thanked him, and looked up at the sky. Storm's coming, she said, not about the weather. Shaq nodded, his jaw tight, and didn't say a word. He could feel it too. Behind all this peace, something waited. Not with noise, but with precision. It crept slowly, like the cruiser down the block, like the eyes that scanned instead of saw, like the suspicion that wrapped itself around black bodies without asking permission. The quiet corner house stood unchanged. But the world around it, it had started whispering again. Not loudly, not yet, but soon. The morning sun hung low, casting golden light on Oak Ridge Avenue, yet the mood on the street was anything but warm. The calm that usually coated the neighborhood like morning dew had gone brittle. People still walked their dogs and waved out of habit, but their eyes darted to the corners more often now, watching, wary. A storm had been rumbling beneath the pavement since the patrol car first showed up. Today it broke the surface. It started like any other Tuesday. Miss Odessa Monroe was on her porch, watering the row of petunias that lined her front steps. Her gait was slower than usual. Her left hip had been bothering her again, but her face, dignified and graceful, bore no sign of complaint. She hummed an old gospel tune as she moved, taking care not to spill water over the edge of the planter. To anyone watching, it was a scene of routine, a peaceful slice of morning. But the cruiser didn't see peace. It saw possibility. It saw something to question. The blue and white police car rolled around the corner slower than usual. Inside were two officers. Young, buzz-cut sharp, new to Oak Ridge. Officer Kellen Reeves, 28, eyes always squinting like he didn't trust the sun. And his partner, Officer Chad Foster, fresh from a suburban beat with a badge that still gleamed like a toy. They had transferred just 3 weeks ago, part of a departmental shift meant to increase visible presence. But what they brought instead was suspicion wrapped in protocol. As they passed Odessa's gate, the cruiser paused. Renee Chambers watched it unfold from her porch. She was sipping from her thermos, eyes narrowed, heart already thudding. She didn't know the officers by name, but she knew the look. It wasn't curiosity, it was calculation. She stood up slowly, not rushing, not drawing attention, but ready. The car reversed, tires crunching against the curb. Odessa barely had time to turn before they were out of the vehicle, approaching with clipped steps and authoritative tones. "Ma'am, can we see some ID?" Officer Reeves said. No greeting, no smile. Odessa blinked, confused but not rattled. "Excuse me? You were seen loitering around this property. We've had reports of a suspicious person matching your description in this area." She stared at them, watering can still in hand. "This is my home," she said, the words flat, factual. Foster glanced at the house, then back at her. "Do you have proof of residence?" Renee could hear everything from across the street. She set her thermos down and took a step off the porch. Her instinct told her to go, to intervene. But another part of her knew how these things went. You stepped in too fast. You became part of the problem. Odessa lowered the watering can, carefully. "I've lived here for over 40 years. My name is Ms. Odessa Monroe. You can check your records." "That's not an answer," Reeves said, reaching for his radio. "We need to verify who you are." She tried to move toward her front door, calmly. "Let me get my ID from inside." Foster blocked her path. "We didn't say you could leave the area." Now her voice cracked. I'm not leaving. I'm getting identification. Reeves stepped forward, his tone sharp. Ma'am, I need you to calm down. I am calm, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But it didn't matter. In less than a minute, the scene transformed. Odessa was asked to place her hands on the rail. When she questioned why, they accused her of non-compliance. Her request to speak to someone else was dismissed. And then, without warning, they pulled her arms behind her back. No punches were thrown. No knees pressed into her back. But the handcuffs were too tight, and when they pushed her slightly against the rail to steady her for a search, the sudden motion made her stumble. Her wrist banged hard against the wood. She winced, but didn't cry out. She couldn't find her voice. Renee started across the street then, fast, shouting now. That's Miss Monroe. That's her house. But the officers didn't turn. Odessa, now seated on the steps, hands restrained, stared blankly at the garden she'd just been tending. Her hat had fallen to the concrete. Her water can lay tipped over, water bleeding into the soil. Reeves turned to Renee as she approached. Ma'am, stay back. You don't know who you're dealing with, she snapped. That woman has lived here longer than you've been alive. Reeves' face didn't flinch. She matched a description. She is the description of this neighborhood, Renee hissed. And you just assaulted her in her own yard. The officers hesitated then. A flicker of doubt. They hadn't expected resistance. Hadn't expected witnesses. Without ceremony, Reeves unhooked the cuffs. Foster offered no apology, no explanation. Odessa's hands trembled as she rubbed her wrist, her eyes never lifting. Renee rushed to her side. Are you hurt? Odessa didn't speak, not right away. Her silence screamed louder than any accusation. The officers muttered something into their radios and walked back to the cruiser. They didn't linger this time. They drove off fast, trailing a dust of shame and silence behind them. Shaq returned hours later, stepping out of his truck with 2 bags of groceries and a song playing low on his phone. Renee met him at the gate, face tall. You need to come inside. His steps quickened. He found Odessa sitting in her chair, hands folded neatly, her gaze unfixed. The watering can was gone. Her wrist was wrapped with a dish towel. Renee stood behind her, arms crossed, ready to explode. Shaq sat beside Odessa slowly. Tell me what happened. Her voice, when it came, was measured. They thought I didn't belong here. Shaq didn't respond right away. His breath deepened, jaw clenched, but no anger spilled. Just Renee picked up the story, her words fast and clipped. They rolled up, questioned her like a trespasser, cuffed her, pushed her against the rail. They didn't even know her name. Did they say why? They said she matched a description. Shaq exhaled slowly. And what's the description of a threat now? Gray hair and a garden hose. No one laughed. That night, Odessa didn't come out to the porch. The tea stayed untouched. The flowers remained thirsty. Renee sat on her own porch, watchful, and Shaq stood under the lamplight by Odessa's gate for a long while, arms crossed, eyes scanning the street. Injustice had arrived in broad daylight, and it hadn't worn a mask. But something deeper lingered, something unspoken. Why Odessa? Why now? She had lived here unbothered for decades, had never been stopped, never been questioned. So why had these officers chosen this day, this moment, to escalate? Shaq felt it deep in his bones. This wasn't just about new cops on a beat. There was something else at play, some thread connecting Odessa's quiet history to the sudden storm. He would find that thread. And when he pulled it, the whole lie would unravel. The night settled over Oak Ridge Avenue like a thick wool blanket, heavy and muffling. Windows dimmed one by one, porch lights flickered off, and even the wind seemed reluctant to disturb the uneasy silence that had fallen after the incident with the patrol car. Odessa Monroe sat alone in her living room, her lamp casting a pale circle of light around her recliner. Her teacup sat untouched on the side table. Steam long vanished. The television was on, volume low, not for entertainment but for noise, an attempt to push back the echo of that morning's humiliation. Her wrist still ached. Renee had offered ice, but Odessa had waved her off with a polite smile. The pain wasn't just physical, it was something older, heavier. It pressed against her ribs and coiled beneath her skin. She had thought herself past being broken, but something about being made to kneel in front of her own begonias had cracked open an old room in her soul, one she had locked up decades ago. She reached for the rotary phone sitting beside the couch. The same phone she'd used since the late 90s, its receiver slightly yellowed, cord coiled in a lazy loop. She hesitated, her fingers hovering above the buttons. Her address book sat nearby, pages worn and soft, but the number she dialed wasn't written there. It was memorized, tucked away like a holy phrase. The line rang twice. Then came a click, and a man's voice answered, not rushed or distracted, but precise, focused. "This is Monroe." She took a breath that trembled. "Baby, it's Mama." There was a beat of silence on the other end. Then the voice softened. "Hey Mama, what's wrong?" Odessa glanced at the window, made sure the curtains were drawn. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "They did it again. They looked at me like I didn't belong. They put their hands on me." Silence. Then, a slow inhale. "Are you okay?" "I'm not hurt bad. But they humiliated me. They didn't even ask my name. Just dragged me out like I was some kind of thief." Another pause. "I'm coming home." She didn't argue. Didn't tell him not to worry. She knew her son well enough to recognize that tone. It wasn't rage. It was resolve. And when Darius Monroe made a decision, no desert, no war zone, no government boundary stood in his way. After she hung up, she sat in stillness. Her hands shook a little, not from fear, but from what she'd just unleashed. Her son was a ghost to most of the world. Few even knew he existed. And those who did only whispered his name with reverence. He wasn't a man who belonged in living rooms. He belonged in classified files and war maps. The next morning, Renee came over with a basket of muffins and a fury she'd been bottling since the previous afternoon. Odessa listened quietly as her neighbor vented, her hands still wrapped from baking, her voice like sandpaper over gravel. "They can't get away with this." Renee spat. "You don't treat a woman like that, let alone one who built this damn block." Odessa nodded, but said nothing. "You need to file a report, a real one." "I already made a call." Renee looked at her, surprised. "To who?" Odessa's eyes didn't meet hers. "My son." Renee blinked. "You mean Lionel? The one in Florida?" "No, not Lionel." It was then that Renee noticed the old trunk near the fireplace, one she'd never seen open before. Its top was cracked slightly ajar, revealing the dull shimmer of something metallic. Curiosity piqued. Renee leaned down and lifted the lid. Inside lay a series of carefully folded uniforms, dark green and desert tan, with a name patch, Monroe. Beside them, encased in velvet, were medals, some easily identifiable, others etched with symbols she didn't recognize. A faded photo lay tucked in the corner, a tall, broad-shouldered black man in military gear, standing beside a helicopter, his face half-shadowed by a helmet. "Who is this?" Renee whispered. Odessa stood quietly behind her. "My son, Darius."
You never mentioned.
"I didn't need to. He never came back. Not once he joined. Said he couldn't mix this world with his." "But Delta Force?" "Odessa, this is serious." "I know," she said softly. "That's why I called him." News of the incident hadn't yet made it beyond the block. The officers hadn't filed any formal report, probably hoping it would blow over. But something had been set in motion now. Something that wouldn't be contained by silence or bureaucracy. Shaq returned later that day. When Renee told him about the call Odessa had made, his reaction was measured, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of something: respect, surprise, and perhaps a sense of awe. He'd heard of Darius Monroe, though not by name. Everyone in certain circles had. A ghost soldier. A man who went in when all other options failed. She never mentioned him. Shaq murmured. "She didn't need to," Renee replied. "Some powers are quiet." Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Commander Darius Monroe stood in a secured terminal in an undisclosed location. He was clean-shaven, dressed in civilian clothes now, but his presence still turned heads. His orders had been suspended. A favor had been called in from someone high up, the kind of call you didn't ignore. As he waited for his flight, his mind replayed his mother's voice over and over. That slight tremble, the unspoken hurt. He hadn't seen her in over a decade. Part of it was his job, but part of it was something else, distance born from protecting her from who he had become. He never imagined she'd be the one needing protection. Back in Oak Ridge, the neighbors whispered. Renee couldn't help but share bits of what she'd found, enough to stir curiosity but not suspicion. Odessa's house, once a symbol of peace and routine, now buzzed with quiet intrigue. Why hadn't she ever mentioned a son? What kind of son responds with "I'm coming home" and mobilizes like a general? Why did his medals include awards that no civilian could name? Shaq didn't ask questions. He just made sure Odessa had what she needed. He reinforced the front steps, added a new lock to the back door, and stayed close. He could feel something coming, not a fight, but a reckoning. And Odessa? She sat on her porch again. Finally. Her hands still trembled, but her eyes were sharp. She looked toward the horizon, waiting not with fear but with the knowledge that someone who owed her nothing had answered a call with everything. A quiet storm was coming. And this time it had a name. He arrived without warning. No flashing lights, no press, no family reunion waiting at the curb. Just a black SUV pulling up to the curb on Oak Ridge Avenue at 2:47 a.m., its engine murmuring low before falling silent. The door opened, and out stepped Darius Monroe, wearing a plain black jacket, boots scuffed from travel, and eyes that scanned the neighborhood like he was surveying a tactical zone. There was no hesitation in his step, no dramatic pause. He walked straight to the gate of his mother's house, opened it quietly, and disappeared inside. Renee, who often dozed lightly with her curtains cracked just enough to watch the street, caught the movement. She didn't reach for her phone. She didn't wake anyone. She simply whispered to herself, "He's here," and turned off the lamp. The next morning, Odessa's porch light came on earlier than usual. A second rocking chair appeared beside hers. It was empty for now, but its presence alone whispered that something had changed. A line had been redrawn. By sunrise, Oak Ridge had begun to stir. The usual rhythms resumed. Paperboys, barking dogs, and the scent of bacon from Mrs. Goldstein's open window. But beneath it all, something pulsed. It was in the air like pressure before a downpour. Shaq pulled up in his truck around 8, a thermos of coffee in one hand, a newspaper under his arm. He paused at the gate, noticing the new chair. When he stepped onto the porch, Darius was already there. He hadn't changed much, not in the ways that mattered. His frame was leaner now, all precision and posture, but his face still carried the echoes of the teenager Shaq had once coached in the community center's makeshift basketball league. Back then, Darius had been quiet, driven, always thinking 3 plays ahead. Shaq used to call him the chess player with a jump shot. "Morning, coach," Darius said, voice low and steady. Shaq offered a slow nod. "You're taller. You're wider." They both smirked. Just a flicker, and with that years folded like paper between them. No questions were asked about flights or timelines. No one asked how long he'd stay. They sat side by side on the porch, sipping coffee while Odessa tended to her garden like nothing had shifted. But in truth, everything had. By mid-morning, Darius disappeared down the street, wearing a ball cap pulled low and a pair of sunglasses. He didn't announce where he was going. He didn't need to. Shaq knew enough to recognize reconnaissance when he saw it. Darius didn't need weapons or brute force to make an impression. He had the kind of presence that unsettled without effort. For the next few days he became a ghost with eyes, appearing at corners, blending into bus stops, walking past the precinct on accidental errands. He memorized patterns, watched where the cruiser parked when it wasn't circling, timed how long the officers stayed inside the quick stop on 8th and how often they spoke to a man in a navy blue sedan who never got out of the car. Shaq played a different role, more visible, more deliberate. He showed up at the precinct, under the guise of a community liaison, offering free youth basketball workshops. He brought flyers, shook hands, and smiled wide. He knew how to play approachable. He let the desk officers think he was there to keep the kids busy, to talk about respect and goals, and staying off the streets. But what he was really doing was studying the layout. He noted who logged the body cam footage, where the complaint forms were filed, and which officer responded with a twitch when Odessa's name was casually mentioned in conversation. The trap wasn't steel and teeth. It was patience and pressure. Renee watched the whole thing unfold, like a spectator at a slow-burning chess match. She noticed how Darius never stayed in one spot too long, how he always walked with his hands visible, how he seemed to vanish and reappear with surgical precision. She admired his restraint. She also noticed how Shaq played his part with charm, disarming the front desk sergeant with stories about NBA road trips, and slipping in pointed questions between laughs. One evening, Darius returned to the porch with a small notepad. He handed it to Shaq, who flipped it open and scanned the names. "These two," Darius said, tapping the paper. "Reeves and Foster. They're not just aggressive, they're connected to something." Shaq leaned forward, Like what? Private group chats. Unauthorized surveillance. Possibly even collusion with a retired officer named Bartley, who runs security for a local watch association. I've seen that Navy sedan 3 times, always trailing either of them. They're not rogue. They're following a thread. And Odessa? Darius's face darkened. She was the warning shot. They weren't targeting her by accident. She was chosen. Her history, her house, her visibility in the neighborhood. Darius was starting to see it. This wasn't just bias. It was strategy. We pull the thread too hard, and they'll cover it up, Darius said. We need evidence, proof they've been manipulating patrol routes, internal communications, footage. I can try the precinct again, Shaq offered. No. You've done enough for now. I'll go in. Shaq raised an eyebrow. You don't have a badge. I don't need one, Darius replied. I've got clearance. There was something final in his tone, but not reckless. Darius didn't bluff. If he said he'd get something, he'd already planned 3 ways to do it. Over the next 2 days, the atmosphere tightened. The cruisers slowed more often in front of Odessa's home. Foster stepped out once and stood on the curb for a full 5 minutes, pretending to type into his phone while his eyes scanned the porch. But Odessa didn't flinch. Darius sat right beside her, posture relaxed but unreadable. The trap was nearly ready. That night, Darius sat with Renee for the first time. She made coffee and pulled out the old photograph from Odessa's trunk. You look just like your daddy, she said softly. Darius smiled faintly. That's what Mama says. Why'd you stay away so long? He stared into the coffee. 'Cause this place was peace. I didn't want my world bleeding into it, Renee nodded. Too late for that now. I know, he said. That's why I'm staying. Until it's done. Back in the house, Odessa folded laundry, while humming softly. Shaq leaned against the doorframe. Never thought I'd see him back here. He's always been mine, Odessa said, smoothing out a towel. But he's never belonged to any one place. Shaq nodded, understanding. Darius had been shaped by something too wide for small-town boundaries. But he'd returned not as a son but as a force. A quiet storm. And he wasn't done yet. Langston Wade was the kind of man most folks didn't notice unless they needed something. He wore the same faded hoodie every day, eyes darting like he was tracking 3 thoughts ahead of any conversation. At 36, he still lived in his aunt's basement and ran a tech repair business that operated more out of trust than licensing. But Shaq trusted him, had since the day Langston fixed his nephew's cracked phone screen and refused payment, saying, "Just tell folks I ain't a thief." When Shaq called, Langston came without questions. They met in the back room of the community rec center, the one Shaq had unofficially claimed as his quiet corner. No basketballs, no noise, just folding chairs and a mini fridge humming in the corner. Renee was already there, arms crossed, eyes sharp, not quite trusting but open to results. Darius hadn't come. He preferred shadows now, not out of secrecy, but because observation meant clarity. Langston set down a beat-up laptop, cracked his knuckles, and got to work. You said you had some names. Reeves and Foster, Shaq said. Both patrol, new to Oak Ridge. Langston nodded. Give me an hour. In the quiet that followed, Renee paced. You think we'll find something? She asked. Shaq didn't answer directly. We already found too much. When Langston finally looked up, his expression had changed. No smirk, no cockiness, just concern layered with disgust. You're not gonna like this. He turned the laptop toward them. On the screen was a series of screenshots, group messages from a private encrypted platform used by some officers statewide. Langston had backdoor access through an old server connection, a leftover from a cybersecurity grant he once worked under. It was a graveyard of digital footprints, and what he found wasn't just careless, it was cancerous. The group was titled Shield and Grit. 73 members, all law enforcement. Renee leaned in. Is this real? Langston nodded. Oh, it's real. Been archived for over a year. Some of it goes back further. Reeves and Foster are regulars. They post daily. Shaq read one message aloud. Voice slow and low. Respect isn't given, it's enforced. They don't fear us yet. Another post showed a grainy phone photo of a black teenager leaning against a wall. Caption, corner ornament. Wonder if he speaks English or just Ebonics. Langston clicked through faster now. Images, memes, slurs coded in cop humor. Advice on how to word reports to deflect accusations. Tips on how to subdue without evidence. Praise for officers caught on tape, framed as martyrs. Foster had posted a map once, marked with red X's. Problem areas, mostly black neighborhoods, some including Oak Ridge. They're radicalized, Langston muttered. From the inside. Renee's fists clenched. This ain't just one incident. It's a culture. Her voice cracked, not from weakness but from the weight of knowing. She had lived through enough to recognize the shape of systemic rot. It didn't come in hoods anymore. It wore uniforms, typed in group chats, and smiled during traffic stops. Shaq sat back, the air heavy around him. And they targeted Odessa. Why? Langston clicked again. This is 2 months ago. The post was from Reeves. It showed an overhead shot of Oak Ridge. The caption read, "Let's clean the corners. Some of these pillars been standing too long." Renee's breath caught. "That's not coincidence," she whispered. Shaq nodded. "That's a threat." They had chosen Odessa because of who she was. Visible, respected, connected, not a criminal, but a symbol, a disruption to their illusion of control. This wasn't about crime. This was about presence, about reminding a community that even their elders weren't untouchable. Langston leaned back. "I can download all this. Secure drive. But you need more than screenshots. You need proof that they acted on it. Something admissible." Shaq glanced at Renee. "That's where Darius comes in." Darius was already moving. That evening, he visited an old contact in the Department of Defense who owed him a favor, not a massive one, but enough. A name, a signature, a file accessed remotely from an external terminal, nothing illegal, just invisible. Within hours, he had access to a state enforcement monitoring feed, patrol logs, badge pings, GPS trails. He cross-referenced Reeves and Foster's patrol logs with the incident at Odessa's home. Times didn't match the official report. Their car was logged half a block away, but video footage taken from a city traffic cam 2 streets over showed them idling in place for 32 minutes. That length of time had been scrubbed from their logs. Falsified data. The trap was almost complete. Back at Odessa's house, Renee narrated into a voice recorder. Shaq had given her. Not for court, for clarity. "People always think racism lives loud," she began. "But truth is, it's quiet. It's in the shift of a patrol schedule. In the way reports disappear. It's the look a man gives you when he knows he has a system behind him, and you've only got silence." Her voice held no tremor now. Just fire. "This ain't just about Ms. Monroe. This ain't just about Oak Ridge. This is about power, and who it protects, and who it don't." Shaq listened to the playback and nodded. "Keep that. That's our intro." Renee tilted her head. "Intro to what? Our proof. Our story. We leak this the right way. We start the burn." They had screenshots. Audio. Video. Logs. All sourced, all time-stamped. And they had a narrative. One that didn't scream, but cut deep. Shaq called an old ESPN contact. Someone who now produced documentaries on social justice. Renee reached out to a journalist she once helped raise money for, during her days with the church. Darius? He contacted no one. His job was nearly done. Late that night, the 3 of them met in Odessa's living room. The room smelled like vanilla candles and old paper. Langston was on the floor, transferring everything to a hard drive. Renee sat upright, watching. Shaq stood at the window. And Darius? He remained silent in the corner, arms crossed, eyes burning with a fury he didn't show. He didn't need to. The fabric of fear had been unraveled. And now the world was about to see what was woven beneath. Dawn arrived over Oak Ridge with the same tentative glow it always did, but the air carried a tension deeper than morning light. Miss Odessa Monroe stood at the window, straight-backed as a queen reviewing a kingdom under threat. The volume of the morning radio crackled low, offering weather and sports updates that felt distant, irrelevant. What she needed was history, not headlines. Shaq arrived early, carrying fresh grocers and a determination that hadn't quieted. She greeted him with a small smile, but her eyes kept drifting toward his expression, searching for what he'd learned. She poured tea for him and herself, then sat across the table in the kitchen, the kettle's whistle a fragile punctuation between them. "They're drawing lines," Odessa began, voice soft but resolute. "Not just against me, against everything my husband stood for." Shaq nodded, inviting her to continue. Odessa's late husband, Harold Monroe, had been more than a civil rights lawyer. He'd been a force. In the 1970s, He took on cases that rattled precincts statewide. He fought housing discrimination, police brutality, and voter suppression. His name was whispered in precinct houses like a warning, the kind of name that unsettled uniforms and shook institutional complacency. Harold had filed a landmark case against the same Oak Ridge precinct nearly 30 years ago, accusing them of racially biased policing. The suit had ended in settlement, policy revisions, and temporary promises, but it had never fully changed the culture. The precinct had become quieter, more careful, but resentment had seeped into its structure, passed down to younger officers who learned its unspoken lesson. Odessa's chin trembled as she continued. After Harold died, I believed his work had cracked something open. But I never imagined new uniforms, new names. They learned more than just procedure. They learned hate. Shaq's gaze didn't waver. He had seen the messages, heard the logs, and watched his son gather evidence. But hearing the lineage, the inheritance of spite, made the threat personal in a new way. It's not random, Odessa said quietly. It's ancestral. Shaq's hand reached across the table, lightly touching hers. You didn't tell Darius? She shook her head. I wanted this to be his sanctuary. When he left, I needed this place to stay safe for both our sakes. He nodded. He understood protection disguised as omission. They moved to the living room, where Renee was waiting. She carried her camera and lens carefully, as though it were as delicate as the truth she was striving to expose. She flipped through photos she'd taken over the last few days. Officers entering and exiting a quiet house around the corner, speaking to a man with a law enforcement decal on his door. Filtered through her lens, the precinct's infiltrators had become spectral, images meant to validate fear. Renee's finger hovered over one photo. This man, she said, voice low. He's not active law enforcement, but he acts like he still owns the streets. Shaq leaned in. The photograph captured two officers, Reeves and Foster, chatting with a middle-aged man outside a nondescript brown house. The man had a past ex-cop, dismissed for excessive force, open to vigilante justice. He'd started hosting community watch meetings with white supremacist undertones, meetings that had flown under the radar of internal affairs because no one had connected him to current patrols. Not until now. Odessa closed her eyes. Harold saw these people. He warned me. Shaq's lips parted, but no words came. He folded the images, pocketed them carefully, then looked up. I promise you, no one steps foot in this neighborhood again, without consequences. Renee recorded his vow on video. It was proof not of promise but of accountability. Late that afternoon, Shaq suggested visiting the old precinct station, under the pretense of following up officially about Odessa's complaint. Renee and Langston would stay back, stashing evidence, preparing statements, while Shaq confronted the bureaucracy head-on. Darius again watched from the edge of circumstances, silent in the background. Inside the precinct, Shaq asked to speak with the sergeant in charge of internal affairs. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He sat across a desk that smelled of coffee and old uniforms, and he presented a timeline. Incident on the 6th, verbal assault, handcuffs, unwarranted detention. Patrol logs for Reeves and Foster show them elsewhere. Photographic evidence shows them consulting with a known vigilante. Encrypted messages among officers indicate racially motivated policing. He handed them copies of logs, links to digital storage, and printed images. The sergeant accepted them solemnly, his initial irritation draining. He whispered something to a junior officer, leaned back, then met Shaq's gaze. We'll investigate. Shaq didn't feel relief, not yet. Outside, Darius watched through the tinted windows. He noted the sergeant's body language, the slight slump, the nod when he thought no one was looking. Small signs, but signs nonetheless. A needle had pricked the system. They left without ceremony. Not a press release. No confrontation. Just a quiet exit, but with enough evidence to keep the wheels turning. Back on the porch, Shaq lit a cigarette, his first in years. His eyes met Odessa's from across the door. She looked smaller now, fragile in her age, but something in her steadied him in ways he couldn't explain. You did good, she said. He crushed the cigarette into the ashtray. We're just getting started. Renee handed Odessa another printout. It was a collection of old news articles from Harold's cases, marginalized by time, slight headlines shadowed. But they mattered. They were lineage, proof, connection. They were the foundation from which hate had grown under new names. Odessa traced the headlines with her finger. He kept everything. He believed our story mattered. Renee cleared her throat. It does. Night descended, and with it came a lull that felt more ominous than silence. The refocus was coming, both from the precinct and the vigilante network. Words had been spoken. Doors had been opened. Stakes had been raised. Darius remained quiet as he sat between Shaq and Odessa on the porch. He lit a cigarette of his own, one he also hadn't smoked in years. He inhaled slowly. Bloodlines, Odessa whispered, as though naming an old ghost. Darius exhaled. I know how to cut them. Their shadows fell long across the wooden boards, joining under the lamplight. They were different ages, different burdens, but tonight, collectively resolved. The precinct had received the files. The city would receive the story soon. Someone, somewhere was paying attention. They didn't need to shake windows with anger or roar demands. They needed to steady their ground. They needed to show that truth, when organized, when evidence-backed, could unsettle even the most entrenched systems. No physical force. No immediate retribution. Just strategy, proof, and presence. Justice done not with fists, but with files, bloodlines, and badges on the record. The quiet storm had turned calculated, and there was no turning back now. The sky over Oak Ridge turned to pewter gray, as summer waned, casting long shadows across driveways and rooftops. It was a city in waiting, not for a verdict or a riot, but for something deeper. A reckoning had begun to take shape, and the streets knew it. Conversations at coffee shops paused when patrol cars drove by. Children who once played past dusk were called home early. The quiet wasn't fear, it was awareness, the kind that settled in the bones before it made its way into headlines. In a borrowed workspace at the back of the old community library, Darius Monroe sat with nothing but a laptop, 3 secure flash drives, and a black notebook filled with times, names, and diagrams only he could read. His posture was tight, his jaw stiff from focus, his fingers moving like a surgeon, not fast, but deliberate. The system he was inside didn't know it had been breached. The precinct's security grid, buried beneath layers of outdated municipal code, opened with barely a whimper. He didn't gloat. He extracted. First came the raw footage, day-stamped, camera-numbered, motion-tracked. He sifted through hours of hallway silence, filing room passes, empty corners. Then he reached the field cams, body cams uploaded at the end of each shift. Not all were logged. Some had corrupted entries, but enough were intact to reveal patterns. He watched as Foster approached a young man in a hoodie on 12th Street. The man was walking home with headphones in. No conversation, just a shove into a wall. The sound was muted, but the aggression was unmistakable. Another file. Reeves ordering a middle-aged woman to empty her purse on the hood of his cruiser. She was coming from church. Her hands shook. More footage. A teenager dragged from a basketball court, cuffed for questioning. No arrest. No charge. These were not accidents. They were rehearsals. Darius noted timestamps, cross-referenced with patrol logs, then cross-checked names with civilian complaints filed and ignored. It was a pattern. He backed the data onto 3 separate drives. 2 would go public through encrypted drops. 1 would stay with him. The drive he kept had names and connections. Who logged the footage, who deleted what, and when. It painted a clear picture. The suppression wasn't just on the street. It was systemic. Back at Odessa's house, Shaq had gathered neighbors, elders, teachers, former activists, people who remembered what it felt like to walk for truth without knowing who would walk beside you. They met in Odessa's backyard, not for secrecy, but for grounding. The jasmine still bloomed, the porch lights still flickered on at sunset, but their mission had changed. Shaq held up a folder, copies of reports, screenshots of chats, redacted precinct memos with unmistakable patterns. We're organizing a march, he said. Peaceful, purposeful, not for noise but for notice. The room nodded. These were people who'd seen movements rise and fall. They knew the weight of resistance when it didn't wear slogans, when it came dressed in family, in principle, in necessary discomfort. Renee offered to write the speech. I'll say it plain, she said. People listen when it comes from the heart, not a headline. Later that night, on the back porch, she clicked her recorder and spoke into it softly, the moonlight bathing her face in silver. Truth doesn't knock down doors, she said. It moves like wind, unseen but undeniable. It reshapes the world slowly, steadily. We don't always hear it, but we feel it when the room shifts. She paused, then continued. They tried to shame Ms. Monroe into silence. But silence isn't submission. It's strategy. They forgot one thing. History doesn't die in a chair. It whispers until someone listens. Her voice faltered just once, then regained its footing. This is not a protest against police. It's a march for memory. For the children watching. For the elders who never stopped watching. For the truth that outlasts uniforms. The next morning, Darius uploaded the footage to a secure site. The files began to leak across the city like cracks in a dam. An anonymous account tweeted out, "This is what justice buried looks like." Attached was a 2-minute compilation, timestamped footage of Reeves and Foster, side by side with dismissed complaints. The video went viral in under an hour. By noon, the mayor's office had issued a statement, calling for an internal audit. The precinct released nothing, but every officer now wore their badge with tighter lips. Shaq walked into the precinct that afternoon, not to file, not to confront, but to deliver a formal letter of notice. The neighborhood would be holding a march that weekend, permitted and legal. The route would begin at the high school, past the community center, and end in front of the station. No threats, no chance, just present. The sergeant didn't speak. He took the letter and nodded, but his eyes followed Shaq as he walked out. Something unsettled behind them. That night, Darius returned to the porch. Odessa was asleep. Renee sat near the steps, watching the wind blow the American flag hanging from a neighbor's pole. Darius didn't say much. He didn't need to. Renee finally spoke. "You did good." He looked away. "Not enough yet. But you made them see." He nodded. "Now we make them feel." Oak Ridge was no longer just a street. It had become a stage. And every shadow now carried meaning. The night didn't come with thunder. No siren screamed through Oak Ridge. No wind rattled windows in warning. It was a quiet night, almost too quiet. The kind that presses into your ribs and whispers that stillness doesn't mean safety. Beneath the hush, something moved. Ms. Odessa Monroe had turned in early. Her sleep had become shallow in recent weeks, her body reacting to the undercurrent of dread that no candle or gospel hymn could ease. Renee stayed up late, as she often did now, reviewing emails from community allies, checking timestamps on the leaked footage, making sure nothing was slipping past them. At 2:12 a.m., the porch light at Odessa's house flickered once, then blinked out. Then came the sound, barely a noise, just a breath of a scrape, a shuffle on the wooden steps. Renee heard it from across the street. She reached for her phone, heart pounding with certainty. This wasn't a random creak in the old boards. Something was happening. By 2:17 a.m., Odessa's back window had been pried open. A figure slipped through, then another. They moved with calculated silence, their flashlight beams dim and precise. They weren't looking for valuables. They weren't even searching. They knew what they had come for. They found it in the cabinet by the fireplace, the box with Darius's medals, and the framed photo of him and Harold Monroe in matching uniforms. The only physical connection between 3 generations of strength. The intruders opened the box, spit on the medals, then scratched deep, jagged lines into the metal with the edge of a screwdriver. They left the frame shattered, the photo torn. By 2:25 a.m., they had moved back to the front door. One of them raised a canister and sprayed a smear of black paint across Odessa's living room wall. "Stay in your place," it read. They thought they'd gotten away with it. But the camera caught everything. Not the precinct-installed body cams. Not some random ring footage. This was different. Darius's doing. Thermal lensing mounted under the gutters. Infrared sensors, hidden in flower pots. 2 angles feeding directly into an off-site drive. The kind of surveillance you didn't see unless you knew what war looked like. At 3:01 a.m., Darius arrived. He hadn't slept. Renee called him, voice calm but shaking under the surface. He entered the house through the back, checked Odessa still asleep, mercifully unaware, and then walked to the living room. The damage was deliberate, the desecration personal. By 3:14 a.m., Shaq pulled up. He didn't knock, just entered, eyes scanning the room slowly. He paused at the words on the wall, then at the twisted metal that had once sat in Harold Monroe's office with pride. He said nothing. Darius handed him a tablet. The footage played in silence. It showed 2 figures in plain clothes, but familiar frames. The walk, the stance. One lifted his cap briefly. It was Foster. The other, Reeves, scanned the room with a hunter's gaze, nodding to himself as if to affirm this is the right target. Shaq's hand curled into a fist, but he didn't swing. He stared longer. We don't report this, Darius said quietly. Shaq looked over. We expose it. Every frame. Every second. By sunrise, the footage was cut, time-stamped and prepared. It wasn't a revenge tape. It was a documentary slice, detached, surgical. Just the facts. No commentary. No me. The video was uploaded at noon, under the headline Truth Doesn't Sleep. It included a timestamp, a location, and a voiceover from Renee, recorded at dawn, her voice low and shaking, but resolute. They didn't come to steal. They came to shame. But you can't shame people whose strength is carved into bone. You can scratch metal, tear paper, but you can't erase history. And you can't silence truth. The video spread faster than the last. News outlets picked it up within hours. Activists across the city reshared it with one caption: still happening. That evening, the mayor issued a citywide address. Internal investigations expanded to include surveillance misuse, civil rights violations, and obstruction of justice. The police union went silent. The precinct locked down its digital systems, but too late. Renee stood on her porch as the sun dipped below the rooftops. She watched reporters circle the block, but none were allowed past the gate. Odessa sat quietly inside, staring at the repaired medals, now mounted on a different shelf. They bore scratches, but their meaning had only deepened. Shaq walked the sidewalk with Darius, saying little. Their silence was a shield between them, not distance, but trust. Think they'll retaliate again? Shaq asked. Darius shook his head. They don't have time now. They're exposed. They're in retreat mode. Shaq glanced at the house. Still feels like war. It is, Darius said. But now we're the ones watching. That night the light stayed on in Odessa's house. Not in fear, but in clarity. The storm had finally made landfall. The morning after the footage dropped, Oak Ridge Avenue felt different. It wasn't louder or busier. In fact, it was as still as ever, but the stillness had shifted. It wasn't fear anymore. It was focus. Something had landed, heavy, irrevocable. Truth had arrived, and no one dared look away. Media trucks lined the outer perimeter of the neighborhood like a polite siege. They stayed at a distance, cords snaking across sidewalks, cameras pointed not at chaos but at calm. The world had been watching cities burn, leaders shout, fists clench. But today, all lenses turned toward a porch, a green-shuttered house with a wooden swing, a frail elder, and one very large man, with a heart bigger than his legend. Shaquille O'Neal, the giant most new from sports arenas, in commercials, stood before a row of microphones. There was no podium, no velvet ropes, just a man standing on the front steps of Odessa Monroe's home, his shadow falling across the very boards that had once trembled under boots and injustice. He wore no suit, no logo, just a plain navy blue sweater, and the quiet determination of someone who'd seen enough. The press had gathered quickly once word spread that Shaq would speak. Not tweet, not post. Speak. Odessa sat behind him in her rocking chair, hands folded neatly in her lap. Renee stood off to the side, camera in hand, not filming, but watching, documenting in the oldest way by remembering. Shaq cleared his throat, glanced at Darius near the doorway, then looked into the sea of lights and recorders. I'm not here as a celebrity, he began, his voice deep but steady. I'm not here as a politician. I'm here as a neighbor, a friend, a witness. He paused, allowing silence to anchor his words. Ms. Monroe is 78 years old. She taught children to read. She raised sons, buried a husband, who fought in courtrooms, so people like me could walk streets like this. A few weeks ago, she was handcuffed on her own porch. Yesterday, that same porch was broken into, not by criminals but by people wearing badges, or hiding behind them. Cameras clicked, but the crowd didn't murmur. They were listening now. This isn't a story about bad apples. This is about systems that hide rot. And it's about what happens when good people decide to say something, instead of turning away. He turned slightly toward Odessa, his voice softening. She didn't call the mayor. She didn't call a lawyer. She called her son, and that son didn't come home with anger. He came with facts, with truth, and with a calm that shook the room harder than any protest. Shaq's eyes returned to the crowd. We don't want war. We want reckoning. We want restoration. We want to know that our elders can water flowers without fear. That our kids can walk home with hoodies up and music in their ears, and not end up face down because someone decided their skin was a threat. There was no applause. Not yet. It wasn't that kind of speech. It was weight, not performance. The two officers responsible are now under investigation. But let's be clear, this ain't about two names. It's about every name the system forgot, and everyone we won't let them forget again. He stepped back, giving the moment room to breathe. Renee's voice, later that evening, would be used in a local news segment as narration over footage of the porch. People think power lives in noise, she said, her voice like the slow bend of a river. But the kind of power that changes things lives in presence, in how you stand, in when you refuse to move. Within 48 hours of Shaq's message, the city shifted. Internal Affairs launched a broader probe. Reeves and Foster were officially suspended, pending criminal review. The ex-officer tied to the break-in was placed under federal scrutiny for violating surveillance laws. But the biggest shift wasn't legal. It was human. Across the city, families pulled out old photos of elders, of marches, of ancestors who had stood still against storms. Schools started conversations they'd been avoiding. A student in South Oak Ridge wrote a poem that ended with the line, "He didn't raise his voice, he raised his porch." Community centers began receiving donations, including one from a quiet, unnamed foundation tied to a former NBA player. Odessa's porch became symbolic, featured in magazines, art installations, and classroom debates. But none of that changed her morning routine. She still rose early, still set out her tea, still hummed hymns under her breath. One morning, a young girl rode by on her bike and waved. Odessa smiled, returned the wave. Behind her, Darius stood near the door. On the radio, Renee's voice played again. Not every war is won with marching. Some are won when giants kneel down and say, "No more," and then stand back up, not with fists, but with open hands. That's what this was. Shaq, meanwhile, returned to work quietly. No tours, no interviews, just a man who'd done what needed doing. Because sometimes, the biggest hearts carry the heaviest truths. And sometimes all it takes to change a city is one man, one porch, and the choice to stand still long enough for the world to see what dignity really looks like. The sun broke over Oak Ridge, soft and golden. The kind of light that made even the most weathered fences look newly painted. A breeze whispered through the branches of the sycamores that lined the street, carrying with it the faint scent of morning dew and the sound of something rare and quiet: hope. Ms. Odessa Monroe sat in her rocking chair, exactly where she'd always been, only today she held something different in her hands. It wasn't tea or knitting needles, or the worn copy of her late husband's favorite poetry. Today she held a small American flag folded once, its fabric slightly wrinkled, the stripes soft from years in a drawer. To anyone passing by, it may have seemed simple, patriotic, traditional. But for those who had witnessed what had happened on this porch, and everything since, the flag was something else entirely. It wasn't a symbol of perfection. It was a reclaimed gesture, a quiet act of ownership over something that for too long had been used against people like her. Standing beside her was Darius. He didn't wear a uniform, though his posture gave him away. He was still and upright, his expression unreadable but clear. His presence was deliberate. He wasn't there to guard the porch. He was there to stand with it. Down the street, the neighborhood had gathered. No one shouted. There were no chants, no signs, just bodies present, alert, grounded. Shaq stood among them, hands tucked in his pockets, nodding to familiar faces. Renee stood beside him, her notebook in one hand, camera slung around her neck, capturing not the frenzy of conflict, but the rare stillness of closure. Not final, but firm. The reporters had come again. Only this time, there was no yellow tape. No controversy to exploit. They came for something they rarely covered: resolution. The mayor arrived shortly after. No police escort, no stage, just a folded piece of paper in his inside jacket pocket. He made his way to the porch and paused at the bottom step, not speaking until Odessa looked up and nodded once. Then, and only then, he climbed the steps. He stood beside Darius, cleared his throat, and held out the document. "This bill," he said, "is being introduced today as the Monroe Act. It requires full transparency of internal precinct communications, mandates automatic investigations of any altered body cam logs, and establishes a permanent civilian oversight committee with subpoena power. It also allocates funding for neighborhood justice programs, starting here, in Oak Ridge." There was no applause, Just the rustle of leaves and the low hum of cameras rolling. Odessa unfolded the paper gently. She read the first few lines, then handed it to Darius without a word. He folded it again, tucked it under his arm, and nodded once. Renee turned toward the street, speaking softly into her recorder. Some people will say this started with an arrest, or a broken window, or a speech, but truth is, it started when one woman refused to be invisible, when a porch became a platform, when a neighborhood chose to watch and not turn away. Her voice wasn't broadcasted, not yet, but it would be. Across the street, a teenager named Lamont, who used to avoid the precinct side of town, raised his phone and live-streamed the moment. In the comments, someone typed, "This ain't the same old story." And it wasn't. Because this time, no one was waiting for permission to matter. Shaq moved closer to the porch, not stepping up, but placing his hand on the railing. He looked at Odessa, then at the flag. "You sure about that?" he asked quietly. She smiled, faint but firm. "It's not their symbol anymore. It's mine now." Harold would have wanted it that way. Shaq nodded. "Then it stays." Darius looked down the street, his eyes catching the skyline in the distance. This had always been a small part of the city, ignored, underserved, underestimated. But now it had become something bigger. A starting point. A statement. Not one made with fists or flames, but with presence, patience, and pressure. Later that evening, the footage of the porch gathering aired on every local station. It played not as a protest or a riot, but as a reconciliation, a reckoning, a new rhythm. National outlets picked it up. Analysts discussed the law, the footage, the movement. But the real story wasn't in courtrooms or press rooms. It was still on that porch, where the flag waved slightly in the breeze and a rocking chair creaked in rhythm with time. Odessa didn't speak much after that day. She didn't need to. Renee's final narration, in the audio essay that followed, said it best. Peace doesn't roar, it rises. Quiet at first, subtle, but undeniable. It moves like sunlight. Slow, steady, and impossible to stop. That's what we've seen. That's what we carry forward. And the story closed, not with a period, but with a question. What happens when we stop turning away? The flag waved. The porch stood strong. And the future, for once, felt earned. If this story stirred something in you, don't let it settle. Talk about it. Share it. Let your silence be the last thing they expect. Raise questions at your dinner table, in your classrooms, on your block. Justice doesn't start with the powerful. It starts with the ones who stay. And maybe, just maybe, you're the one who doesn't turn away.